do something about what's going on. And Lord knows we need you to be engaged at this point in time, right? So good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy. It's a 30-minute weekly show that airs on KSFR 101.1 FM or streaming from ksfr.org. And it airs every Saturday morning at 8:30, and it has since the February of 2017. So we're in our fourth year. I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy, and our guests this morning are Fred Nathan and Kristina Fisher, both from Think New Mexico. And we'll be talking about their outstanding new report, really good report, how predatory lending swallowed New Mexico and what we can do about it. And we'll also be talking about State Amendment 1. That's the New Mexico constitutional amendment that would take the vote away from voters in selecting PRC commissioners. It would give that right to the governor. It would also reduce the number of PRC commissioners from 5 to 3 and extend their term to 6 years. So there's a lot at stake in that, and Fred and I are on the same page with that one. And we'll talk about that first before we get into other things. But we'll get back to Fred and Kristina in just a second. But first, a few announcements. Last week, we spoke with Elaine Sullivan, board president for Alliance for Local Economic Prosperity, and Melissa Pickett, the Alliance's outreach coordinator. For some time, the major initiative for the Alliance has been to establish a state public bank in New Mexico. And during the show, we heard about the major progress they've made in getting a bill formulated. It's being written up by the Legislative Council right now, and it'll be ready for the 2021 legislative session. And we also heard about, some of the important ways in which a public bank could be such a positive force in the state, could really work well with community banks and credit unions and with state reserves, and utilizing those to re-stimulate our lagging economy and to diversify it. So you can watch all these past shows by going to retakeourdemocracy.org, hovering over the actions and events menu, and clicking on Retake Conversations, and they're all listed there in chronological order. And so if you're driving around right now and you missed some of the show we're going to be airing right now, you'll be able to pick that up on recording at retakeourdemocracy.org, probably by 10 or 11 in the morning on Saturday. And while you're at our website, check out our election strategies. We have like 4 distinct strategies for ways in which you can get involved in the state legislative races or in national elections. And in particular, we have a get out the vote strategy that in like 10 or 15 minutes, you could engage dozens of your friends from anywhere in the country to make sure they have a voting strategy. And obviously that's a very important thing these days. And the nice thing about that is it's also sort of a pyramid scheme kind of process where you encourage your friends to then do the same thing to 15 or 20 people that they know. We've had well over 1,000 people utilize the strategy. So we know we're having an impact there. And obviously we've got, when you're listening to this show, it's being recorded on October 12th, but it's airing on Saturday, and that's 17 days from the election. And that just makes me shiver when I think about it. We obviously need to be on our game. Trump has 17 more days, and Lord knows what he's going to pull. It's been absolutely frightening, his rhetoric, since he left the hospital. So we're asking our listeners and Retake subscribers to do much more than just vote. We need you to be reaching out to others, and we need you to really devote a fair amount of time every day now to election strategies. This show is being actually recorded on October 14th. And since Trump's exit from the hospital, he's been a raving lunatic. So and no one can feel safe about our democracy. Lastly, we can offer another reason to go to our website, as we have published our voters guide with recommendations on all kinds of down ballot initiatives in Taos, Santa Fe, Sandoval, Doña Ana, Bernalillo, Rio Arriba, and Silver City. So head over to retakeourdemocracy.org and check that out. And that's also under the elections menu. That's enough for now. We've got a good deal to talk about. The effort to cap small loans at 36% has been a retake priority for 3 years. We were immensely disappointed with the 2019 legislative effort that while capping rates at 175%, and that's not a mistake, this fell far short of the 36% rate that had been proposed in the legislation. And but things are going to be very different in the Roundhouse in 2021. So we're going to find out what Think New Mexico has planned and what they've done with their report. Welcome, Kristina and Fred. I like to let our guests introduce themselves. And so if you want to go first, Kristina, tell us just briefly how you wound up with Think New Mexico and anything else that might help our listeners know who you are.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having us on, Paul. I grew up here in Santa Fe, and when I was in college, Fred was founding Think New Mexico, and I was lucky enough to get an internship there my junior year of college, and it went very well, and Fred invited me back full-time after I graduated. So I have actually been at Think New Mexico since 2002, took 3 years off to go to law school at the University of New Mexico, but have been here ever since, and have worked on a variety of efforts that we're very proud of.
Cool. Okay. Fred, how about you?
Well, I just want to say, first of all, thanks again for having us. And Kristina's way too modest. What she didn't mention is she graduated #1 in her law school class at UNM with the highest GPA in the history of the school. So I always say, you know, Kristina really should be working at a think tank. I don't know how I wound up here, but I'm the founder of Think New Mexico.
That always helps.
Yeah, that helps. You're exactly right. Always hire people that are smarter than you. Before that, I worked for Tom Udall in the Attorney General's office and worked on a variety of things like suing the tobacco companies, which reminded me of why I went to law school, and a variety of legislative issues, and just saw the need in this state for a think tank that would focus on solutions rather than ideology and some of the other things that get our legislature hung up rather than on solving problems.
Well, I think the bulk of the conversation today will be about predatory lending, if I have anything to say about it. But I know that Fred is like eager to talk about the constitutional amendment #1, which he fervently opposes, as do I. So do you want to take a minute to lay out, you know, basically what it is and why you oppose it?
Sure. So Constitutional Amendment 1 would change the Public Regulation Commission from an elected body to an appointed body. And there's 3 good reasons to oppose this. And the proponents say that they want to raise the qualifications and that can only be done with an appointed commission. They overlook that in 2012, voters in New Mexico passed a constitutional amendment drafted by Think New Mexico that raised the qualifications of the PRC commissioners. It used to be that you only had to be 18 years of age, lived in the state 1 year, and not be a convicted felon. That was it. And so, not surprisingly, they had a lot of problems. So in 2012, we proposed raising those qualifications so that every commissioner has at least 10 years of relevant educational background or work experience. That passed overwhelmingly, Paul, with the highest number of votes for a constitutional amendment since statehood. So the public has already sort of fixed this. And just to give you an example, here in Santa Fe, we have 2 people running for the PRC. One is a civil engineer, Joseph Maestas, who's also been a mayor and a city council, and he's running against a libertarian who has a PhD in physics and owns a green energy company. So, you know, Jerome Block Jr., for example, who held the position before them, was totally unqualified. He'd be ineligible to run now because of the new qualifications. So that's #1. #2 is the ballot language itself conceals the real purpose. It never mentions that if you vote for Constitutional Amendment 1, you're going to give up your ability to vote for PRC commissioners and hold them accountable. And so, you know, just as a general proposition, I just think ballot amendments ought to be transparent and honest about what they're doing. And then the third reason is reason alone to reject this constitutional amendment. And that's that there's a dark money PAC called the Committee to Protect New Mexico Consumers. They've spent over $250,000 on these very slick, misleading mailers trying to get people to support this. They will not disclose, however, who's funding this. And, you know, when you think about it, if this is such a good idea to make it an appointed commission, why are the people that are funding this not willing to disclose who they are? And it
I have an idea.
I bet you do. And I have the same concern, which is when you think about who has the motivation and the amount of money that's been spent, and we're hearing that they're also reserving about $250,000 of television time. You wonder who would have the capacity to do this and whether it might be the utilities themselves.
Oh,
and the
no.
utilities should never be in a position of choosing their own regulators. So there's 3 quick reasons. I'm sure you've got some others, Paul. I know we have limited time, but we really sincerely hope that all of your listeners and viewers will vote against Constitutional Amendment 1.
Well, for all of our listeners, I'd suggest going to retakeourdemocracy.org and take a look at under the elections menu. We have our position on Amendment 1, and it is strongly opposed. We have other reasons. One of them is that by reducing it to the PRC to 3, there's very little, it's impossible to for that 3-member body to represent the cultural and geographic diversity of the state. And then the other thing is that in 2017, the National Regulatory Research Institute published, they were paid by the state to do a study of the PRC. And what the NRRI does is they use best practices nationally in regulatory agencies and kind of contrast our PRC with those best practices. And they made like about 6 or 7 recommendations, most of them about actually funding the PRC so that they can hire the experts that all the phony mailers decry. I mean, they say we need to have experts making these decisions, but they haven't funded the staffing to provide that expertise. Right now, the PRC commissioners, the 5 commissioners, share a single expert, and the NRRI report recommends at least 1 per commissioner. And so, you know, none of these things have been implemented, and yet we leapfrog past a report that, and by the way, the NRRI did not have as one of its recommendations, have the governor appoint commissioners. So there's abundant reasons not to support this initiative. And I would encourage our listeners not just to go to and read this, our recommendation, no vote, but to share it with as many people as they can, because, you know, Fred's Think New Mexico and Paul's Retake Our Democracy can't compete with $500,000 in dark money sending out very misleading ads. It's very interesting that the ad focuses on what is a real common sense. Yes. Wouldn't you like to have decisions like this made by experts? Well, yeah, of course. Who's opposed to that? But they don't tell you that what they really have in mind is eliminating your voice from the selection of commissioners. So we spent a little more time on that than I had expected, but you know, I think I made Fred happy. So we'll move on now and let Kristina have a bit of the show. Kristina, could you tell us just a little bit about the predatory lending industry, how it's evolved in New Mexico, and you know, sort of set the stage for how the predatory lending actually works?
Sure. So when we're talking about predatory lending, What we're talking about is small dollar loans, usually just a few $100s at very high interest rates. So as you pointed out in the introduction, in New Mexico, our interest rates can be as high as 175% per year. And it's sort of hard to wrap your mind around what that means. So we lay out an example in our report of a $400 loan. So if you borrow $400 at 175% a year, over the course of that year, that will cost you $700 in interest. So if you try to pay it back over the course of a year, you will be paying $1,100 to borrow $400. So you have to pay back the $400 you borrowed plus $700 in interest. And because this is so exorbitant, most people that take out these loans don't end up paying them back very quickly, if at all. So the statistics are about 4 out of every 5 of these loans are rolled over or refinanced rather than paid off within the term that people think they're taking them out for. And because they are so highly priced, they're also highly profitable. And so that's why we see in New Mexico, we have 545 of these small loan storefronts. And I'm sure your listeners have driven past many of them. World Finance, Title Max, you see them kind of everywhere in the state. Especially clustered around Native communities, because that's a target population. And Fred and I read through some of the financial reports from some of these companies, like World Finance, and they literally say we like to target states that allow us to charge very high interest rates, because that's how we make our profit. And we open our report with the story of one woman who took out a few $100 loan to buy some firewood. So this is Mary Shea. She lives on the Navajo reservation near Gallup. So she borrowed this money because of the high triple-digit interest rate. She couldn't pay it back and ended up taking out other loans to pay back the first loan. The lenders were calling her at work and at home. And she was eventually paying $600 every month in interest and still not able to keep up and pay off these loans. And that squeezes out what she had to pay for groceries and utilities and just the basics of life. And so you multiply that story across 500,000 of these loans taken out every year in New Mexico, and that's sending hundreds of millions of dollars a year out of the state to these predatory lending companies. 85% of them are based outside New Mexico. They're not mom and pop shops. And that just exacerbates New Mexico's poverty. So that's the problem that we start with that we want to address. First off, by limiting that interest rate, taking it way down from 175% to 36%. And I think Fred wants to get into a little bit of the history, which is interesting, because this isn't actually the first time that we've had this problem or this solution come up in New Mexico.
Yeah. So Fred, how about if you just lay out, sort of how it has evolved as an industry in New Mexico? I was actually quite interested in this part of your report.
Yeah, it really is fascinating. So if you go back before statehood, the first bank in New Mexico was actually here in Santa Fe, 1870. But banks back then catered almost exclusively to wealthy people and to businesses. And so most people were unbanked, if you will, and they depended on their friends and their relatives if they needed a loan, or maybe even a pawnbroker. But one of the fascinating things that Kristina found in her research was an Albuquerque Journal editorial in 1914, so right after statehood, where they're decrying this new industry called loan sharks. So they've been with us for a long time, basically since statehood. And right after statehood, for about 2 decades, you saw the legislature wrestling with how to deal with loan sharking and interest rates. And then around 1955, the legislature finally got their arms around it and put in a cap at 36%. And that cap worked beautifully for 25 years until about 1980, Paul, when there was an accident of history, and some people may remember this, which is the high interest rates in the late 70s, early 1980s. And the legislature at that time decided that the best thing to do would be to actually repeal that cap. And then almost immediately, there was a flood of these predatory loan companies coming into the state. But what I really want to emphasize is the solution that we're proposing, capping interest rates at 36%, is actually not a new idea in New Mexico. It worked very, very well for a quarter of a century from about the mid-1950s to 1980. But then you have these predatory loan companies coming in, and Kristina explained beautifully how that works, and that these companies actually target high interest rate states with low regulation, which puts New Mexico right in the crosshairs. And it's fascinating when you look at the publicly traded companies under the SEC have to file what's called a 10K, where they have to disclose what their business model is. And they're not at all shy about some of them just saying, like World Acceptance Corporation, which has the second highest number of stores in New Mexico. They've got about 50. Just to put that in context, McDonald's has 90 stores in New Mexico. So you've never heard of this company, but they're almost as big as McDonald's in New Mexico. And they, their whole premise is to get consumers into these debt traps. And they say, you know, we, many of our customers become repeat customers. And that's by design. It's by design. So that's a quick history of predatory loan companies in New Mexico, or loan sharks.
So Fred, another question for you. This baffled me. I haven't been around the legislature nearly as long as you have. But when that rate went from 36 to 175, I was just mystified. How is it that it's so difficult to get something like this done in the New Mexico State Legislature?
Well, I can just answer that by pointing out in the 2019 session, when they couldn't get the rate down lower than 175%, there were about 20 lobbyists on that bill. I mean, literally an army. Usually on a big bill, you might expect, you know, an industry to have 3 lobbyists, but 20 is enormous. And then if you look at their contributions over the last decade, it's $899,500. So when you put those two things together, the amount of money that the industry's willing to spend to keep that rate high, and you know, there's only 112 legislators. So if you've got 20 lobbyists, that's about 5 or 6 legislators per lobbyist. And by contrast, you know, think New Mexico, you know, there's 2 of us who are lobbyists. So we've got about 50 or 60 legislators to try to have a conversation with about these rates. So it is sort of a David and Goliath type battle. And there have been some very good people. I just want to give a shout out to a couple of groups like Prosperity Works. Kristina helped me out here. AARP.
Center on Law and Poverty.
Center on Law and Poverty is terrific. NAVA, which is a Native American group. So, but they've just been overwhelmed with lobbyists and money on the other side that they simply can't compete with.
All right, well, this is going to be certainly one of the bills that we're pressing for in the 2021 legislature. I just want to remind our listeners that it is at times like these during COVID that KSFR is more important than ever. It offers all kinds of timely news, alerts, and a wide range of programming to keep you sane while you're holed up. So for those of you who can afford it, please consider going to KSFR.org, and they've got a big donate button up there. You can't miss it, and click on that and give them 10 or 20 or 50 bucks and just view it as your ticket for admission to, you know, 24/7 great entertainment and news. And actually next week we will be live because it's going to be Pledge Week, and so Roxanne and I will be handling that show. But today we're speaking with Kristina Fisher and Fred Nathan, and they're the authors of Think New Mexico's excellent report on predatory lending, how predatory lending swallowed New Mexico and what we can do about it. So let's get back to that conversation. And Kristina, one of the things I found so fascinating in the report was your focus upon how predatory lending had become such a serious threat to our national security That wasn't anywhere on my very long list of things that were wrong with this industry. Fill us in on how these loans became a security risk and what Congress did about it.
Sure. Well, this was a really interesting thing that we learned as well during our research. So back about 15 years ago, I'm sure many of your listeners will recall, we had hot wars going in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the US was actually facing some real recruitment shortages in terms of getting more members into the military. And so Congress ordered the Department of Defense to do a report, and they came back in 2006 and said, you know, one of the big problems we're having is predatory lending, because these lenders are locating all around the base. They're taking advantage of our service members who are mostly young, they're financially inexperienced. They are getting into debt over their heads. And unfortunately, that's creating security problems, because people who are in debt are blackmail risks, are potential problems for the military. So they're actually having to leave the military, or they were having security clearances rejected. And so about 80% of the security clearance failures they found were due to predatory lending. And this was a serious problem. So the Department of Defense said, you know, these lenders are actually hurting our military readiness. We need to do something. And in 2006, under President George W. Bush, and Republican House, Republican Senate, they passed the Military Lending Act, which caps all credit to service members at 36%. And this is nationwide. There are about 17,700 members in New Mexico, active duty, reserve, National Guard, that are already protected by a 36% cap. It is illegal to offer them credit that's more expensive than that, because Congress found it would hurt our national security to have them get into this triple-digit interest debt. And so one of the things we think is those protections should be expanded to everybody. It shouldn't just be limited to the military.
Okay. Well, we're running low on time. We've got about 2 minutes left. And so I want to leave time for both of you to, or for one of you, to let our listeners know where they can get more information about Think New Mexico. I'll close up the show. And then listeners, we will continue to talk about predatory lending and other issues for the podcast that will be available at retakeourdemocracy.org. So Fred, you raised your hand.
Sure. I'd encourage your listeners, if they want to know more about this, to go to our website, www.thinknewmexico, written out as one word, .org. And if they're interested and would like to get a complimentary copy of the report, and they're a member of Retake Our Democracy, just send us an email and say, send me a report, and we'd be happy to send that. And the other thing I just wanted to throw in is, in addition to the 36% cap, we're also looking forward to working with Retake Our Democracy on making financial literacy and personal finance a mandatory course for graduation, as 17 other states in the United States have done in the last decade, including 3 of our neighbors, Arizona, Texas, and Utah.
We will be talking more about that in just a minute if you're listening to the podcast, but we're going to have to close the show now. I just want to close by saying one thing. It's the same thing I've been saying for weeks. We've got an election on November 3rd. It's 17 days away. I can't emphasize enough how important you can be in those 17 days. I want to remind you also that Abbas Akil would not have been in the legislature in 2018 and 19 if it hadn't been for Retake volunteers every weekend canvassing for Abbas. And we had like a dozen canvassers most weekends, including Roxanne and I. And we can't canvass now. So what we do ask you to do is to contact, we have 7 high priority races. If we get those 7 people elected to the legislature, bills like what we've just been talking about will be far more likely to wind up on the governor's desk. So get engaged, contact friends and ask them to get engaged. And on November 3rd, pray. We'll be back next week with our pledge drive conversations, and stay safe, stay hopeful, and stay active. It's the only way we fix this mess. And by the miracle of podcast, we're back. And so, Fred, you were just telling us a little bit about the how the the bill that you'll be introducing, or that will be introduced and that you will support, includes a financial literacy program. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So New Mexico is ranked 47th out of 50 states in our financial literacy, mostly because we've got a disproportionate number of people who are unbanked or underbanked. And so what a number of states have done, which is, we think, a terrific strategy and gives people the tools to stay away from predatory lenders, is to make financial literacy or personal finance a mandatory requirement to graduate from high school, just like sex ed, which is something also that isn't really taught very well at home. So, and for your listeners wondering, well, what does that mean, a financial literacy course? It's really just teaching kids, and usually that we're talking about 12th graders, is the way most states do it, about budgeting, about saving, about investing, about credit scores, about borrowing money. And it's really something that's caught on, Paul, around the country, in blue states and in red states, we noticed, because in the last decade, 17 states have made this a high school graduation requirement, 21 in total. The interesting thing about New Mexico is Mo Maestas, shout out to Mo, got a bill through about, Kristina, correct me if I'm wrong, about 10 years ago, that made it an elective. And so we looked and said, okay, it's an elective. What percentage of students are taking it? It's about 11%. So we'd essentially like to go from 11% to 100%. We talked to people that are teaching those electives, and one of them was just telling me about how many of her students come back to see her and tell her, out of everything I learned, this was the most valuable course I took. And what's exciting to me is that in some of these other states, what they're finding is the kids take it. So sometimes it's not taught in the 12th grade. Sometimes it's taught in middle school, sometimes 9th grade. And what invariably happens is the kids bring it home to their parents.
Right.
So you've got kids teaching their parents. So it's a great strategy to defeat poverty. And so we're optimistic that these two issues can be taken up together. We'll probably do them, Paul, as separate bills, because one is really amending the education curriculum statute. The other is just the small loan statute. So we probably couldn't put them in the same statute, but we believe strongly in both of them, and we think we need to do both.
You know, it's surprising what students aren't taught. I mean, it's not just financial literacy. They don't learn about relationships. This is the thing that I bridle about. They don't learn about relationships. They don't learn about parenting. They don't learn about civics anymore, and
Sure.
how governance really works. I mean, you read about history, you know, and it's often a very jaded or incomplete perspective on history. And none of that prepares you for the important decisions you have to make as an adult in the world. And, you know, I'm sorry, you know, knowing when the railroad ties finally came together and we were spanning the US continent, the date that happened is not something that comes up every day in your adult life. And so it's a sad factor that the schools so ill prepare you for the decisions you really do have to make. So,
and you know, Paul, we're always wringing our hands, all of us as citizens, about the public schools and the dropout rate. And when you talk to kids, and I've seen surveys, the number one reason they drop out is they don't find it relevant to their lives. Well, what could be more relevant than, as you said, relationships and things like financial literacy and personal finance?
right.
So it's also a strategy to keep these kids in school.
I hadn't thought of it that way, but you're right. You're right. We had skipped over one question that was for Kristina. And, you know, one of the arguments used by the predatory industry, predatory lending industry, is that it can't make money if rates are capped at 36%. And they'll have to shut their doors, and all these mom and pop stores, and our economy will collapse and the sky will fall. And they've got, as Fred said, 20 folks roaming the hall with this message. But it's a little bit like our president. It's like not really predicated on any truth. Can you comment on this, Kristina?
Sure, and you're absolutely right. They paint a picture of this parade of horribles that will happen under a 36% cap. And so part of the research that we did this summer was look at what has happened in other states that have enacted 36% caps, because New Mexico is not alone in dealing with this problem and not alone in honing in on the solution. So we looked at places like South Dakota and Montana, Virginia, places that have enacted 36% caps, and figured out what had happened there. So both pieces of the argument that the predatory industry make are false based on what's happened in other states. So the first piece is we'll all go out of business. In fact, there are multiple companies that are operating in New Mexico that are also operating in states with 36% caps. So there's one called Opportune, there's one called One Main Financial, and they are offering loans at 36%. And so we've actually been in touch with a couple of these companies that have said, yeah, we would stay and operate in New Mexico under 36% cap. So we would not lose all 545 of these small loan stores. We would certainly lose the ones that only come to states that allow high rates and low regulation, but we wouldn't lose all of these stores. And then the second part that we found, because this is the strongest argument that the predatory lending industry makes, is to say people won't have access to credit. If we all close, which we won't, they will have nowhere to turn. And in fact, people have plenty of places to turn and much better options. And so in looking at where borrowers go in other states, one of the top places they go is credit unions. And credit unions, we have 41 in New Mexico with 142 different locations. Their rates are capped at 18 to 28% based on whatever type of loan it is, but they can't get above 28%. So it's already cheaper even than the 36% cap. And what's great about credit unions is they're nonprofits, they're very community focused, and one of their goals is to get unbanked and underbanked people into the system. They do financial literacy trainings. And so it's actually a great place to go for a small dollar loan, because then maybe you get into the banking and credit union system and are able to access many better options. But literally beyond that, even looking at credit cards, which are not a great option, they're still a better option than these small dollar loans. The average rate there is a fraction of what it is. So looking at other states, not all of the small loan stores close, and people have many options and better options for short-term credit, small dollar credit. And so we highlight all of that in our report.
Well, one of the things for the 2019 legislative session, Meg Meltz, one of our volunteers, did some research on predatory lending. This is like, she's just like crazy about this in terms of livid. And in her report, she found, and I don't remember what the citation was, but they had done a study of what happens to people if there aren't these loans available, and they tend to just like ask their uncle to float them $100 or $400 or whatever it is, or a good friend or whatnot. And they didn't go into great detail, but one of the persons said that they had gotten into the predatory lending thing because they were just a little embarrassed to go to their uncle and admit they needed money. And I remember when I was a single dad, there was a time when I could not make the rent, and I had friends. He was an attorney. We went to college together, and he lived about 5 miles from our house. And he loaned me the money, and there was no interest. But it was embarrassing as hell to ask my friend to lend me money to get through a short-term problem. But he did, and we went on. And so, when it appears to be easy, and they sure try to make it look easy, then you go, well, I could ask Jack, or maybe I'll just do this because they're not going to embarrass me. But what they're going to do is tie you to debt for the rest of your life. So
No, you're exactly right, Paul. And they take advantage of that situation. And by being so ubiquitous, they actually create demand for their product, as
Right.
with most industries. They are everywhere, they're easy, they're convenient. And so people slide into these debt traps very easily, and they then can't get out.
yeah. Well, I want to thank both of you for doing this. You know, I don't think we'll see each other roaming the halls in January, which must be of immense disappointment to you guys, because you have like the best location on the planet for being active at the Roundhouse. I'm so envious of, for those of you who don't know, listeners, their office is probably 50 feet. It's directly across the street from the Roundhouse. So that makes for it awfully easy. But I think we'll be all doing this by Zoom in 2021. So good luck with the session. And if you have any closing remarks or comments, you can share them with our listeners now.
Well, just thank you for having us both on, Paul, and thank you for the work that you've been doing, which we appreciate.
Okay, thank you.
Agreed. It's been a pleasure.
Take care, and we'll be in touch. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
No on one.